The biting wind of the Wyoming Territory did not care for mercy, nor did it pause to consider the tragedy unfolding on the desolate ridge of Shadow Creek. Snow, white and blinding, swirled in a violent dance, burying the frozen mud of the trail that led back to civilization. A civilization that had just violently expelled Mei Lin. At 21, she was a vision of tragic incongruity against the harsh monochromatic winter landscape. She wore a light pink prairie dress, the fabric far too thin for the sub-zero temperature, the hem stained with the muck of the road and the tears of a life shattered in an instant. She stood watching the back of the covered wagon fading into the whiteout, the creak of the wheels growing fainter, swallowed by the howling gale. Her family, or the people who claimed to be her family until the money ran out, had not even looked back. They had left her with a small bundle of clothes and a heart fracturing under the weight of abandonment. The cold began to claw through the thin cotton of her sleeves, turning her skin numb, her breath hitching in her throat as a sob tore loose. She was alone. Truly, terrifyingly alone in a land that devoured the weak. If you want to see how this abandoned soul finds a love that defies the odds and a home she never expected, make sure you subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below sharing your own story of resilience. We bring you the most powerful stories of the American frontier, where hope survives the harshest winters. Now, back to Mei Lin's fight for survival. Her knees gave way, and she sank into the snow, the pink dress billowing around her like a wilting flower. The numbness was seductive now. It promised an end to the shame, an end to the fear of starving in a town that refused to hire her because of her heritage. She closed her eyes, the ice gathering on her long, dark lashes. But the wind brought a new sound, not the whistle of the storm, but the heavy, rhythmic thud of hooves. It was a sound of power, of weight. Mei Lin forced her heavy eyelids open. Through the curtain of snow, a silhouette emerged. A massive black stallion, snorting steam into the frigid air, and atop it, a figure that looked more mountain than man. He was clad in a heavy buffalo coat, his face obscured by the brim of a weathered Stetson and a thick woolen scarf. This was Gideon. The locals called him the Lone Rancher, a man who spoke to horses more than people, a man whose silence was as deep and impenetrable as the canyons. He pulled the reins, the horse coming to a halt just feet from her. He didn't speak immediately. He simply looked down, his eyes narrowing not with malice, but with a sudden, sharp recognition of a life in peril. Mei Lin tried to scramble backward, terror seizing her freezing limbs. She had been warned about men out here, men who took what they wanted. But Gideon didn't lunge. He swung down from the saddle with a grace that belied his size, the snow crunching under his boots. He approached her slowly, hands raised, palms open. "Easy," he rumbled, his voice like gravel grinding together, deep and vibrating in the cold air. "You're freezing, miss. You stay here, you die." He did not wait for her permission. The situation was too dire for pleasantries. Gideon reached down, and before Mei Lin could protest, he scooped her up into his arms. She was light, alarmingly so, a testament to the months of rationing she had endured before being cast out. She stiffened against the rough texture of his coat, smelling the scent of pine, wood smoke, and horse. It was an earthy, masculine scent that was terrifying, yet strangely grounding. He mounted the horse with her held securely against his chest, wrapping the edges of his massive coat around her shivering form. "Hold on," he commanded, not unkindly. As the horse turned, pushing against the wind, Mei Lin felt the warmth radiating from him, a furnace of life in a world of ice. She had no choice but to bury her face into the wool of his scarf, her tears freezing on her cheeks. They rode in silence, the storm raging around them, but within the circle of his arms the wind seemed to lose its bite. For the first time that day, the crushing weight of her hopelessness lifted just an inch, replaced by a terrified curiosity about the stranger who had plucked her from the snow. The ride to the ranch seemed to last an eternity, the landscape shifting from open plains to the dense, sheltering embrace of the timberline. The rhythmic gait of the horse lulled Maylin into a semi-conscious state, where the line between the nightmare of her abandonment and the dreamlike rescue began to blur. When they finally broke through the trees, the ranch house appeared, a sturdy, low-slung structure of logs and stone, smoke chugging defiantly from its chimney. It wasn't a grand estate, but it looked immovable, a fortress against the winter. A barn stood nearby, its doors shut tight. Gideon slowed the horse, guiding it toward the front porch. The door of the cabin flew open before they even stopped, and an older man with a distinct limp hobbled out, a lantern swinging in his hand. This was Jeb, the ranch's cook, conscience, and only other inhabitant. His face was a map of wrinkles, his beard gray and wild, but his eyes held a sharp, intelligent gleam. "Gideon?" Jeb called out, squinting into the gloom. "What in tarnation are you bringing in from this weather? I thought you were checking the herd, not hunting for strays." Gideon slid from the saddle, bringing Maylin down with him, though her legs refused to hold her weight. He caught her effortlessly. "Found her on the ridge, dumped like garbage," Gideon said, his voice tight with suppressed anger. He wasn't angry at her. He was angry at the cruelty of the world that would leave a woman in a pink dress to die in December. He kicked the door wider, carrying her inside. The rush of heat was almost painful, the air thick with the smell of stew and burning hickory. He deposited her on a rough-hewn armchair near the fireplace, and Jeb was immediately there, his gruff demeanor vanishing into fussing concern. "Lord have mercy, she's blue as a robin's egg," Jeb muttered, grabbing a thick wool blanket from the back of the sofa and draping it over her. Maylin shivered violently, her teeth chattering. The heat of the fire began to prickle her skin. She looked up, seeing these two large, rough men looming over her in the small, cluttered main room. It was a bachelor's mess, muddy boots in the corner, harness leather on the table, dust motes dancing in the firelight. Yet it was safer than anywhere she had been in years. Gideon stood back, removing his hat to reveal a head of thick, unruly dark hair and eyes that were startlingly gentle despite his stoic expression. He looked at her as if she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve, but one he was determined to protect. "We got soup, Jeb?" Gideon asked, his gaze never leaving Maylin's face. "Hot broth. Now." The recovery was slow and agonizing as the blood returned to her extremities, bringing with it a stinging pain. Maylin spent the first night drifting in and out of sleep on the armchair, terrified that if she closed her eyes for too long, she would wake up back in the snow. But every time she woke, one of them was there. Sometimes it was Jeb, stoking the fire and muttering to himself about the soulless devils who would abandon a child. Other times it was Gideon, sitting silently at the table, cleaning a bridle, his presence a silent sentinel, ensuring no harm could cross the threshold. By the next morning the storm had broken, leaving the world buried in pristine white silence. Maylin sat up, her body aching, but the feverish chill gone. She looked around the cabin with clear eyes for the first time. It was a disaster. Not dirty in a filthy sense, but chaotic. A place where work was the only priority and comfort was an afterthought. Piles of unwashed tin plates, clothes draped over chairs, a layer of dust on the mantel. She stood up, her legs wobbly but functional. She was a guest here, a burden. Her family had thrown her out because she was useless and expensive. She would not let these men think the same. She couldn't pay them, but she could work. She found a basin of water and washed her face, smoothing back her black hair. The pink dress was wrinkled and stained, but she did her best to pat it down. She found a broom in the corner, straw bound to a hickory stick, and began to sweep. The rhythmic swish-swish was calming. She moved to the kitchen, finding the sink piled with dishes. She heated water on the stove, her hands moving with practiced, efficient grace. When Gideon and Jeb came in from the morning chores, stomping snow off their boots, they froze in the doorway. The main room was transformed. The floor was clear of mud, the harness leather was neatly coiled and hung on pegs, the table was scrubbed, and the smell of stale smoke was replaced by the scent of pine needles Maylin had crushed and placed in a bowl of hot water. But it was Maylin herself who stopped them. She was standing by the stove, stirring the pot of oatmeal Jeb had left, looking entirely out of place in her prairie dress, yet completely in command of the domestic space. Gideon blinked, his mouth opening slightly before he clamped it shut. He looked at Jeb, then back at her. You didn't have to do that," Gideon mumbled, looking almost embarrassed by the tidiness of his own home. "I pay my way," Maylin said, her voice soft but laced with steel. It was the first time she had spoken clearly to them. Her accent was slight, musical, a remnant of her grandmother's teachings. "You saved my life. I will not be a leech." Gideon stepped forward, removing his gloves. He looked at her reddened hands, scrubbed raw from the cleaning, and a frown creased his forehead. He wasn't used to defiance, certainly not from someone so small. "You're a guest, not a servant," he corrected her, his tone leaving no room for argument, or so he thought. Maylin met his gaze, lifting her chin. "I am useful," she insisted, the fear of abandonment flashing in her dark eyes. "Please, let me be useful." The vulnerability in her voice struck Gideon in the chest. He saw it then, the terror that drove her industry. She wasn't cleaning because she loved it. She was cleaning because she believed it was the only reason she was allowed to exist. He nodded slowly, a silent agreement. "All right," he said softly, "but you eat first." Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of the ranch shifted. The lone rancher was no longer so alone. The presence of Maylin brought a softness to the harsh winter routine. She mended the tears in Gideon's coats. She organized Jeb's pantry in a way that actually made sense. And the food, suddenly, the simple beans and venison tasted like feasts under her seasoning. But the emotional distance remained. Gideon was a man of few words, often retreating into silence after dinner, staring into the fire. Maylin often caught him watching her when she wasn't looking, a look of longing mixed with confusion on his face. She felt a pull toward him too, this giant of a man who treated her with a reverence she had never known, who walked on the outside of the path to shield her from the wind, who chopped extra wood so the cabin would be warm when she woke. It was a slow-burn attraction, fueled by stolen glances and the quiet intimacy of sharing a small space while the world outside remained frozen. Christmas was approaching. The calendar on the wall, marked with charcoal X's, showed December 20th. The atmosphere in the cabin was shifting toward something festive, or at least, Maylin was trying to make it so. She had found some dried berries and popcorn and was stringing them together. Gideon came in early that evening, carrying a small wooden crate he had retrieved from the supply shed. He looked troubled, turning the crate over in his large hands. He placed it on the table and sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Supplies came in from the mercantile drop-off point down the valley," he said, sounding frustrated. "There's a letter, and some labels on these tins I don't recognize." He paused, the silence stretching thin and tense. He looked at Maylin, then away, his jaw clenching. This was his fortress, his strength. Yet in this moment he looked defenseless. Maylin set down her needle and thread. She walked over to the table. "Which one?" she asked gently. Gideon pointed to a tin can. "Jeb thinks it's the peaches for the cobbler, but I ain't sure." He hesitated, his face flushing a deep red under his tan. "And the letter. It's from the bank." The admission hung in the air. The realization hit Maylin with the force of a physical blow. This man, who could track a wolf across bare rock, who could calm a wild stallion with a touch, who built this house with his own hands, he could not read. It was a vulnerability so profound, so unexpected, that her heart swelled. Here was her protector, exposing his deepest shame to her. She didn't laugh. She didn't pity him. She simply reached out and placed her small hand over his large, calloused one. "This is Peaches," she said softly, tapping the can. Then she picked up the envelope. "And this, shall I read it to you?" Gideon looked at her, searching for any sign of mockery. He found only warmth. He exhaled, a breath he seemed to have been holding for years. "Please," he whispered. As she read the dry, formal words of the bank notice, a simple confirmation of deposit, Gideon watched her lips move, mesmerized. In that moment the dynamic shifted. He had saved her body from the snow, but she was saving his dignity. They were no longer just rescuer and victim. They were partners, each holding a key to the other's survival. The bond between them solidified in the quiet evenings that followed. Mei Lin began to teach him. It started with his name, Gideon. She traced the letters on the frosted window pane, and he copied them, his brow furrowed in intense concentration. When he finally wrote his name legible on a piece of scrap paper, the smile that broke across his face was blinding, a rare, boyish expression of pride that made Mei Lin's breath catch. I never had the time for school," he admitted one night, the firelight casting long shadows. "Pa put me to work when I was 6. Said books don't herd cattle." Mei Lin looked at him, her heart aching for the boy he had been. "Books build worlds, Gideon," she said, "and you are smart. You are smarter than the men who write them." As Christmas Eve drew near, the isolation of the ranch felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. But the world outside was not done with them. The pantry was running low on flour and sugar, essentials if Mei Lin wanted to bake the Christmas cake she had promised them. Jeb's leg was acting up, so it was decided that Gideon and Mei Lin would take the wagon into the town of Silver Creek. It was a risk. Mei Lin hadn't been to town since her abandonment. She feared the stares, the whispers. But she looked at Gideon, checking the harness on the horses, and felt a surge of courage. She was not the same broken girl in the snow. She had a place now. She had a purpose. The town of Silver Creek was bustling with holiday activity. Wreaths of pine hung from the storefronts, and the sound of carols drifted from the church. But the festive atmosphere curdled for Mei Lin as soon as they pulled the wagon onto the main street. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd. A Chinese woman sitting high on the wagon seat next to the reclusive Gideon? It was scandalous to the narrow-minded townsfolk. Gideon sensed her tension. He shifted closer to her on the bench, his shoulder pressing firmly against hers, a silent declaration of alignment. "Chin up," he murmured. "You're with me." They tied the horses and walked toward the general store. But before they could reach the steps, a voice, oily, loud, and dripping with condescension, cut through the cold air. "Well, well, if it isn't the Hermit of Shadow Creek." A man stepped out from the barber shop, flanked by 2 deputies. He was dressed in a fine wool suit that cost more than Gideon's entire ranch, a gold watch chain gleaming across his vest. This was Reginald Thorne, the town's wealthiest landowner and the man who held the mortgage on half the valley. Thorne's eyes slid over Gideon and landed on Mei Lin with a look of repulsive amusement. "And I see you've picked up some discarded trinkets along the way." The insult was sharp and public. The street went silent. Mei Lin felt the blood drain from her face. She knew this man. He was the one who had pressured the businesses not to hire foreigners. Gideon went still. His hands curled into fists at his sides. The peaceful domesticity of the ranch felt 1,000,000 miles away. Here in the harsh light of society, the battle lines were being drawn. Thorne stepped closer, invading their space. "Careful, Gideon," Thorne sneered. "We have decency laws in this town. We don't take kindly to folks who drag the gutter into our community." Gideon's knuckles turned white, the leather of his gloves straining against the tension in his hands. The air on the street seemed to crackle, the festive sounds of Silver Creek dying away into a suffocating silence as the town watched the confrontation between the powerful landowner and the mountain of a man. Reginald Thorne's sneer deepened, his eyes darting between Gideon's clenched fists and Maylin's pale but resolute face. "Cat got your tongue, Gideon?" Thorne goaded, taking a step back as if to invite the violence that would surely land Gideon in a cell. "Or maybe you're just realizing that a man who can't even sign his own name has no business playing house with a discard." The insult to Gideon's literacy was a calculated strike, a poisoned barb meant to strip him of his masculinity in front of the woman he was trying to protect. Gideon flinched, a subtle tremor that only Maylin, pressing close to his side, could feel. The shame radiating from him was palpable, a heat that rivaled the winter chill. He began to turn away, his shoulders slumping, ready to accept the defeat that society had always told him was his lot. He would not fight. He would not give Thorne the satisfaction of arresting him. He would just take the humiliation, as he always had. But Maylin would not. The fear that had paralyzed her moments ago evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity, the kind of clarity forged in the fires of her own suffering. She felt Gideon's withdrawal, his acceptance of the lesser status Thorne assigned him, and it broke her heart more than her own abandonment had. She stepped forward, moving out from Gideon's shadow. Her pink dress was faded, her coat too big, but she stood with the posture of a queen. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice ringing out clear and steady, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. Thorne looked at her, blinking in surprise. "The only thing discarded here is your sense of honor." The crowd gasped. Thorne's face turned a mottled shade of crimson. "Excuse me?" he sputtered, stepping toward her aggressively. Gideon instantly moved to intercept, his body becoming a human shield, his hand drifting to the knife at his belt. "Back off," Gideon growled, the vibration of his chest rumbling against Maylin's back. "She's speaking." Maylin gently placed a hand on Gideon's arm, lowering his defense, not out of weakness, but out of confidence. She walked past him, straight up to the posting board outside the general store where Thorne had been standing. She pointed a slender finger at a notice nailed to the wood, a notice regarding cattle grazing taxes, signed by the mayor. "You stated earlier to the gathered men that the grazing tax had doubled, requiring immediate payment to your bank," Maylin announced, her eyes scanning the text. "However, this notice, dated yesterday, clearly states that the tax relief has been extended until spring due to the severe winter." She turned to face the crowd, her dark eyes flashing. "Mr. Thorne is trying to collect money that is not due. He is banking on the fact that he believes none of you will read the fine print." She looked directly at Thorne. "Literacy is a tool, Mr. Thorne, not a weapon to bludgeon the honest. And Gideon," she turned to look at the stunned rancher, "he may not read your deceitful papers, but he can read the heart of a horse and the signs of a storm better than you ever could. He is 10 times the man you are." The silence that followed was absolute. Then a low rumble of agreement started among the townsfolk. The shame had been reversed. Thorne, exposed as a swindler, snatched his hat and retreated into the bank, hissing threats under his breath. Gideon stood frozen, staring at Maylin as if she were a mythological creature made of fire and light. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It was heavy with unspoken emotion, vibrating with the energy of the line they had just crossed. They were no longer just two people surviving a winter. They were a team that had drawn blood from a predator. The sun began to dip below the peaks, painting the snow in shades of violet and bruised orange. When they finally reached the safety of the cabin, the tension broke. Gideon unhitched the horses with trembling hands, and when he entered the kitchen, he He didn't go to the fire. He went straight to Mei Lin, who was unpacking the flour they had successfully purchased. He stood behind her, his large frame filling the space, his breathing ragged. "You," he started, his voice cracking. "Nobody has ever stood for me. Not like that." Mei Lin turned, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the raw vulnerability in his eyes, the cracks in the armor of the lone rancher. She reached up, her fingers brushing the rough stubble on his jaw. "You stood for me in the snow, Gideon. You gave me a life when mine was over. Did you think I would let a small man like Thorn tear you down?" Gideon closed his eyes, leaning his forehead down to rest against hers. It was a gesture of supreme intimacy, a surrender. "I ain't ample," he whispered, the insecurity leaking out. "I can't give you fancy things. I can't read poetry to you. I'm just a man with dirt under his nails." Mei Lin held his face firmly. "I don't want poetry. I want the man who carried me through a blizzard." That Christmas Eve was the warmest night the old cabin had ever known. The scent of Mei Lin's peach cobbler, made from the disputed can, filled the air, sweet and rich. Jeb, sensing the shift between the two, had retired early to his bunk in the back room, leaving them alone by the roaring fire. They exchanged gifts in the golden glow of the hearth. Mei Lin presented Gideon with a leather-bound journal she had purchased in town with the few coins found in her pocket, a secret stash she had saved. "For your practice," she said softly, "so you can write your own story." Gideon looked at the book as if it were made of gold. His hands shook as he traced the cover. In return, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet-wrapped bundle. He handed it to her, unable to speak. Mei Lin unwrapped it to reveal a silver locket, polished to a shine. Inside, there was no picture, but a folded scrap of paper. She unfolded it. On it, written in shaky, childlike block letters, was a single word: home. Tears spilled over her lashes. It was the first word he had learned to write without her help. It was a proposal, a promise, and a declaration, all in one. But the world outside the ranch was not as kind as the one within. The peace of Christmas was shattered 2 days later by the thunder of hooves. Not one horse, but 5. Mei Lin was sweeping the porch when she saw them. Sheriff Miller and 4 deputies, with Reginald Thorne riding triumphantly at the front. The dread that pooled in her stomach was cold and instantaneous. Gideon emerged from the barn, a pitchfork in his hand, his face setting into a mask of stone. "Sheriff," Gideon greeted, ignoring Thorne, "to what do I owe the visit?" Sheriff Miller looked uncomfortable, shifting in his saddle. "I'm sorry, Gideon. Thorne here, he's got a court order." Thorne dismounted, producing a document with a flourish. "Eviction, actually," Thorne smirked, the humiliation from the town square clearly fueling his vengeance. "See, Gideon, when you signed that loan agreement for the feed 3 years back, that X you scrawled, you didn't just pledge your cattle as collateral. You pledged the deed to the ranch." Thorne waved the paper. "The loan is called in. You didn't pay by the deadline yesterday. The ranch is mine." Gideon dropped the pitchfork. The clang of metal on frozen ground sounded like a death knell. That ain't right," Gideon stammered, the color draining from his face. "You said it was just for the feed. You said I had 5 years." Thorne shrugged. "The paper says 1 year, callable at my discretion. Maybe if you could read, you'd know what you were signing away." The all-is-lost moment crashed down upon them. Gideon looked at the cabin, his father's cabin, then at Mei Lin. He had failed. His lack of education had cost them their sanctuary. The shame returned, tenfold. He looked at Mei Lin with eyes full of apology, ready to surrender, ready to tell her to run while he burned it all down. Mei Lin saw the despair in his eyes, the total collapse of his spirit. He believed the lie because he believed he was stupid. But Mei Lin knew better. She knew the cadence of deceit. She walked down the porch steps, ignoring the deputies who rested hands on their guns. She walked straight to Thorne and snatched the paper from his hand. "Hey," Thorne shouted, reaching for it. "That's legal property." Mei Lin danced back, her eyes scanning the document with the speed of a scholar. She ignored Thorne's shouting, ignored the sheriff's warning. She read the date. She read the clauses. And then she saw it. The ink. The texture of the ink on the bottom clause, the one detailing the land seizure, was slightly raised, slightly glossier than the faded ink of the main paragraph. And the date of the witness' signature. It was dated February 29th of the previous year, a year that was not a leap year. "Sheriff Miller," Mei Lin said, her voice dripping with icy calm. "Arrest this man." The sheriff blinked. "Now look here, miss." Mei Lin held the paper up to the sunlight. "This document is a forgery. Look at the witness date, February 29th, 1875. There was no February 29th in 1875. She stepped closer to the sheriff, thrusting the paper under his nose. "And look at the ink on the forfeiture clause. It's fresh. It hasn't oxidized like the rest. Mr. Thorne altered this document after Gideon signed it. This is fraud, Sheriff. Attempted theft of property and falsifying legal documents." Thorne's face went white. The arrogance vanished, replaced by the terror of a man caught in a lie he deemed airtight. The sheriff, a man who respected the law more than he liked Thorne, squinted at the paper. He looked at the date. He pulled a small calendar from his vest pocket. The silence stretched, tense and agonizing. Then the sheriff looked up, his expression hardening. He turned to Thorne. "You think I'm a fool, Reginald?" Sheriff Miller asked quietly. "You think you can use my office to steal from honest men?" Thorne stammered, backing toward his horse. "She's lying! It's a trick! She's a witch!" Gideon stepped forward then. He didn't need a weapon. The sheer force of his presence was enough. He placed a heavy hand on Thorne's shoulder, anchoring him in place. "She ain't a witch," Gideon said, his voice deep and resonating with a pride that would never be shaken again. "She's the smartest woman in the territory, and you're done." The deputies moved in, not on Gideon, but on Thorne. As the handcuffs clicked around Thorne's wrists, the antagonist who had terrorized the valley was reduced to a sputtering coward. The sunset that evening was a blaze of glory, turning the snow-covered peaks into pillars of fire. The ranch was safe. The threat was gone, taken away in a wagon to the county jail. Gideon and Mei Lin stood on the porch, the silence of the wilderness no longer lonely, but peaceful. Gideon turned to her, taking both her hands in his. They were rough, calloused hands holding soft, healing ones. "You saved it," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You saved everything." Mei Lin smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "We saved it, Gideon. You built the walls. I just kept the wolves out." Gideon looked down at her, the love he felt no longer a source of fear, but a source of strength. "I don't know much," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "but I know I don't want to spend another day on this earth without you." He dropped to one knee in the snow, ignoring the cold. "Mei Lin, will you stay? Not as a guest, not as a housekeeper, but as my wife? Will you teach me everything?" Mei Lin laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that echoed off the canyon walls. She dropped to her knees in the snow beside him, ruining her dress, not caring in the slightest. She threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in the buffalo coat that had once saved her life. "Yes," she whispered against his neck. "Yes, Gideon, I will stay. Forever." As he pulled her in for a kiss, the wind swirled around them, no longer a biting enemy, but a celebration of the spring that would surely come. The lone rancher was lone no more. and the girl sent away in tears had found the one place where she truly belonged.